name's Rubie Clarke. I'm Director of Consultancy and Data Solutions at Fearless Futures. To start us off, a couple of questions by a show of hands. Who's familiar with the term intersectionality? Okay, quite a lot of the room. Who has considered intersectionality as an approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion data? Okay, super. And has anyone in your organization actually looked at DEI data with an intersectional lens? Okay, super. So if the answer to the last question was not you, I'm hopeful that by the end of this talk you'll be inspired, compelled, excited about the potential of bringing intersectionality into how you think about data in your context and use it for your recruitment goals. At Fearless Futures, we serve daring companies across sectors that are ready to actively challenge inequities at their root, their intersections, and their lived realities. We do that by facilitating transformative diversity, equity, and inclusion learning experiences in person and online, and we partner with our clients through consultancy. Everything that we do is in service of designing equitable ecosystems for people and for products. Intersectionality is at the heart of everything we do with and for our clients, including our data solutions. So what is intersectional analysis? How do we apply it to data? And why should we? Often, when it comes to DEI data, our traditional approaches treat categories of identity and systems of inequity as separate. It's certainly how we traditionally have approached data, DEI data. So we may have, when we're collecting data, tick a box for gender, tick another box for race or ethnicity. And then we analyze and measure outcomes for gender, we analyze for women, we analyze for trans and non-binary people, we analyze the outcomes for people of color. From there, we may start to design or tweak our initiatives and our programs across recruitment for people of color, for women, for trans and non-binary folks. But what if you are a transgender woman of color? How does this approach serve to make visible your lived experience across a recruitment process? Think about it like this. All four celebrities on the screen, Malala Yousafzai, Diane Abbott, Dame Sarah Story, and Laverne Cox. They're all women, and so they may all experience sexism. That's a possibility because of their identity, this shared element of their identity. But on account of other factors of their identity, thinking about sexism is not necessarily thinking about the whole picture. Because each of these women may face additional forms of oppression, right, on account of their race, their class, their disability status, and so on. And what's particularly key here is it's not just that there are additional factors to consider, but actually that these experiences are not separate. If we think about someone like Malala, a Muslim woman, Malala can't choose to deal with sexism Monday to Friday and leave the Islamophobia stuff until the weekend, unfortunately. Because as a Muslim woman, the sexism that she may experience may be Islamophobic. And the Islamophobia she may experience may be sexist. There's something very specific that happens where these realities come together. And so if we imagine that these celebrities represent candidates in your pipeline, assessing outcomes for women as one group simply doesn't give us the full picture. And an approach like this, it risks trying to separate what can't be separated. It's a bit like trying to unbake a cake. Once you put the eggs and the flour and the sugar together, the thing that is produced after is more than the sum of its parts, albeit a less palatable one than the examples I'm giving for candidates like this. It's why, when we look at research like the 2022 Broken Ladders report by the Fawcett Society and Runnymede Trust, we see that at nearly every step of the pipeline, women of colour, their representation falls, both relative to white women and relative to men of the same race and ethnicity. Why is that? It's because women of colour experience specific and unique barriers that we can't see if we look at sexism and racism, or we look at gender and race as separate. The same report finds that 52% of women of colour experience discrimination in recruitment. And so these are the realities that an intersectional approach seeks to both reveal and also disrupt. Intersectionality, term first coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, it seeks to reveal and disrupt how systems of oppression and inequity, they come together to produce something specific, unique, and combined, experiences which are more than the sum of their parts. So that where these systems come together, we have specific realities to try and solve for. The traditional or alternative approach is what we might call a siloed approach, or for any data experts in the room, a single axis approach. It's not terrible, but there are a couple of risks to think about. The first is, when we take a siloed approach, we often end up prioritizing the default within a group. If we stick with this example of women that I've started with, when we treat women as a homogenous group, we tend in our approach to recruitment, retention, and elsewhere to be thinking about a particular kind of woman. Our default woman is a woman who may experience sexism, but in all other areas of her identity doesn't experience inequity. And in doing that, when we prioritize the default, we end up invisibilizing specific intersecting barriers that other people, other candidates are facing. And finally, this can lead us to hierarchies of inequity or oppression. If we think that we have to address disableism, sexism, Islamophobia, and other inequities separately, well, then we may decide, okay, we'll prioritize sexism in Q4, and we'll prioritize disableism in Q1 of the next year. And maybe Islamophobia doesn't get thought about until 2-3 years down the line. It's these risks that together, they produce what is ultimately a much less effective approach to building inclusive recruitment strategies and processes. Intersectionality resolves these challenges for us. When we use an intersectional approach to investigate our data, start looking at outcomes for candidates across different groups, we glean deeper insights. It gives us more precise and accurate trends to work with. And by revealing what is otherwise hidden, we're not only seeing the outcomes potentially across our pipeline, but we're able to start realizing where the barriers and obstacles lie. As an approach, intersectional data points us down the right path. And that means we can start to unlock solutions. We can start to tweak and tailor existing programs and initiatives to ensure that they suit all of, let's say, a group of women, and not just our default. That means we can really start to close the gaps that we may not have previously even known were there. But don't take my word for it. Let me show you some proof in the pudding. I've gone really hard on the dessert metaphors today. It wasn't my intention. Clearly, I need a donut or something. One of the ways that we partner with our clients at Fearless Futures is to elevate insights from existing recruitment DEI data. And we do that via intersectional analysis using our software. And one of our wonderful partners in this space is volume recruitment company Amberjack. And in 2023, we used our intersectional analysis software to evaluate a data set from their 2023 data set of over 300,000 candidates across I'm going to say nearly 30 sectors and subsectors. And the insights last year were so revealing and have been really, really useful for Amberjack in developing and starting to steer their clients to solutions that unlock those intersectional barriers. So I just quickly wanted to show you some examples of what an intersectional approach to data can look like in recruitment. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side is the outcomes for university background, for candidates of different university backgrounds. When we looked at offer rates by university alone, we found, sadly, unsurprisingly, it's quite consistent year on year, that Russell Group candidates continue to come out on top. Candidates who graduated from a Russell Group university are over 2.5 times more likely to receive an offer than those who did not, who went to university elsewhere. But when we looked at this university background intersectionally with race and ethnicity, we found something very specific, particular trend that we had not seen, were not able to see before when we were taking a siloed approach. When we looked at offer rates by university background and ethnicity, what we found was all Russell Group candidates of all racial and ethnic backgrounds do receive more offers than non-Russell Group. But for non-Russell Group candidates, there are substantial differences. And as you can see here at the bottom, we found that Black candidates are disproportionately disadvantaged in that group. They receive much lower rates of offers when compared to other candidates who were also non-Russell Group. And so by gleaning these deeper insights, which were never before seen in Amberjack's data, Amberjack were able to support their clients to interrogate where in the process those barriers are existing for particularly Black non-Russell Group candidates, and where these candidates are falling off across stages. That means that we can, again, start to tweak and tailor approaches to try and unlock and remove those barriers for these specific candidates. So, I wasn't meant to reveal that. So that's an example of how using an intersectional approach on data that you already have can start to reveal trends that are frankly hiding in data sets like this and steer towards solutions to remove those barriers. It's not just about seeing where the problems are, but starting to see, okay, where do we direct resource and energy to creating alternative outcomes? But I'm going to hand it over to you to have a chance to think about, from where I am now today, how might I start bringing intersectionality into action? If I'm not a data specialist, what does this look like in the work that I do every day? So we're going to have a scenario-based Slido. And yes, we can have the first one. Thanks, Natasha. So a question for you. I'll read it aloud, and then I'd love to hear or see your responses. The procurement team has implemented new strategies last year to attract diverse talent. A senior analyst presents the data showing an increase in offers to women and Black candidates. What would you do? Impressive level of focus. Okay, great. Let's have the big reveal.
There's a little counter at the top, so I might just leave it one.
Oh, great. Didn't realize. More high-tech than I had originally thought. Okay, super. So many of you selected the top, the one there at the top. You ask, what does the data show at the intersection of race and gender? Some folks are interested in repeating the same strategy next cycle to replicate success. And others have said all of the above, including you wonder about the outcomes for Black women, but you're not an analyst, so you don't follow up. So what's the answer? Natasha, show us. The top answer, you ask what the data shows at the intersection of race and gender. based on what I've just told you, this may have felt really obvious, but the reason I wanted to highlight this is because if we are not data experts and specialists, it can sometimes feel like we don't have the expertise to start pushing for more sophisticated analyses or asking our data teams for this. But actually, by starting to ask these questions, by starting to ask, who are we missing? Who are we not seeing in this data? What might be hiding without this intersectional analysis? We can start to steer our wider teams into thinking in this way. Repeating the same strategy next year, we might want to do that, but the problem is what you might not be seeing by pausing and taking an intersectional lens is that there are specific barriers being hidden in this scenario, particularly for Black women. We'll do one more, Natasha. Yeah, please. I'll try and do this one quickly. So your analytics team looked at the intersection of race, ethnicity, gender, and disability in 2023 data, reveals that South Asian women consistently drop off at the face-to-face interview stage. What would you do here? Okay, the majority have gone for all of the above. So ask for a comparison of outcomes for women of other ethnicities and races. Evaluate the recruitment process, evaluate the interview notes and decision explanations, and find a South Asian woman to be on the panels for next time. So really split across these answers, but most heavily we think all of these are good ideas. So let's see the big reveal. Natasha, thank you. So asking for a comparison for women of other races and ethnicities, why is this useful? Because if we don't have comparison, we can't identify if there is something specific and unique happening. And so being able to compare and contrast data when it comes to intersectional analytics is really key. Absolutely, we want to evaluate the recruitment process. If there is a particular negative outcome for a particular marginalized group, we want to be able to identify where is that happening, right? Is it in attraction? Is it in assessment? Is there a particular style of assessment that's not working, and so on? We also want to know if our process is working, but our practice isn't working, that our policies are effective, but when it comes to the interview, there is actually a specific kind of anti-Asian racism for South Asian women. Finding a South Asian woman to be on the panel for next time, the reason we haven't included this is because as an approach, as a standalone, it can end up transferring the burden for change onto the very community who our data is showing are actually facing barriers. So I would go for the middle three. Thanks, Natasha. So if you're compelled so far by the power of intersectional analytics for recruitment, where might you begin? The first thing I would say is organize your existing data if you have it. It's demographic data, yes, but also when it comes to recruitment, there may be other factors that we want to bring into analysis, which are not traditionally demographic. They're not demographic factors and therefore not traditionally thought of as necessary. So, for example, university backgrounds or other indicators potentially for class. In doing this, it's really important that you have some shared understanding of what is diversity, equity, and inclusion data and what's not. I don't know, you might have something about dietary requirements. That can be an indicator for a particular kind of identity or not. Somebody telling you they're vegan doesn't necessarily tell you anything about how they experience inequity. So having a framework for understanding what data is important is key. Secondly, test driving an intersectional analysis with the largest categories of data. What do I mean by that? So let's say you want to begin by looking at offer rates or outcomes for a particular data set. Usually what we find is that there will be particular demographics that are overrepresented already. And in order to test drive your approach and see how it responds to data that you have, you want to start by looking at the categories, the data where you have these categories represented. Often this is race, ethnicity, and gender, but not always. But if certain people are missing in your data, how do you get the data that you need to start putting intersectionality into action? The first thing I would say is look at your attraction approaches. I'm sorry to say that if your pipeline is really not diverse at all, the problem is probably you and not them, by which I mean that we know that talented individuals of all marginalized identities exist. And so thinking about how do we ensure that we're communicating that our organization is a place where they can survive, but actually not only survive, but actually thrive. So focusing on building strategies and materials that speak to marginalized groups who sit at the intersection of the systems that I've spoken about. Secondly, be explicit about how and why you gather and use data. Lots of speakers have already spoken about this. And so I'm just kind of echoing and adding on this point. It's really important that we start to go beyond the cookie cutter statements. Talking about using data for monitoring doesn't always leave a very positive taste for candidates. And so taking the time to really think about the language that you use and making it clear that not only why, but also how you use this data to track where recruitment processes can be improved and ensure equity and inclusion. What I have learned over the last couple of years is that organizations are actually often sitting on profoundly useful data that can be revealing and instructive about where to direct energy and attention and resource if holistic inclusion is what we are committed to. And so, if you have the data, give it a go, test drive it, and start to think about how do we bring these demographic factors and other factors together to start seeing what we may not have seen before at the intersection. And if you don't have the data yet, then I'm hopeful that this talk has inspired you to think about, well, how do we start to get the data we need to find out where things are working or where things can be improved? Thank you.